Thanks so much to the organizers of these linked symposia for the invitation to be in conversation in these ways. It feels like a true privilege, and having it here makes sense in that so much great work seems to be coming out of Sydney. Thank you to my co-panelist, Astrida, I've probably mispronounced your name already, and to Dinesh Vadivel for the generosity of a response, and to just all of the people who made this possible, including Gemma Viney. So I'm in a little bit of self-induced discomfort due to the style of this presentation. I've been undergoing some rethinking about what intellectual activity needs to be for me, how to handle things like surprise, how to handle things like description. And so in this brief 15-20 minutes, I'll just put a few things on the table that are not mature in the sense that I haven't really made them coherent. I'm hoping to think in rather plain language, but the questions for me are, what is justice in light of the multi-species nature of fire and ash? What is justice in light of death and death's materialities? And are there considerations of secularity to unfold as one might consider a research program in directions of multi-species justice? And so in some way, I think the question of secularity is at the heart of this talk. And I also want to give notice that the artwork I refer to by Fiona Foley, who's an Australian artist, directly and indirectly invokes the historic deaths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Queensland genocidal practices. So this first screen is also an image of a work by Fiona Foley, which I'm not discussing today, which is a permanent installation in the State Library of Queensland. So this talk is a meditation on multi-species justice, and I'm referring in part to Choi and Zhi's notion of suspension, that is at once an integration of air into social theories, epistemologies, and perhaps also a way to anticipate species without isolating them into channels of behavior and reproductivity. But as I said, I'm also thinking about the role of secularity, generously conceived in the kinds of places which foster research programs. So I want to ask questions of institutionality and framing that allow or disallow for certain fabrics of consideration, and I think that's already what we've been talking about this morning. While fire has valences of destruction, death, and renewal, ash is a particulate that can amass former lives, found in both airborne and ground-borne formations with futures of their own. In many places in the world, including parts of Australia and the US, there are some commonalities there, are bound by burdens and anticipatory temporalities of transformative fire and ash. But first, questions of secularity and their reach. So I'll just tell you a story. A powerful thing happened in my critical animal studies undergraduate seminar this year, while the national and global tightening of oppressions continued apace. In this seminar, to talk about animality, to think about creatures, human and non-human, to meditate on lines of difference and union that were not necessarily species lines, to ask why rats were used to spatialize homelessness, why a people's worth in colonial calculus banishes them to animality or humanity. To think too about the strength, vulnerability, and resistance that might be felt to reside in animality. Each of these moments had tendril ties to things we, and by we I mean I and a very special group of students, felt happening around us. In all the turns one of us noted, we kept using the word interconnectedness as an indication of complicit ties within a broad system of seemingly disparate elements, or as a gesture of hope and affirmation, and also, I think, inevitably pointing to forms of harm. In my observation, interconnectedness kept representing a kind of secular tracking of capitalism and its structural co-conspirators. And this is something the students were very, very good at. We discussed race, disability, industrial agriculture, capitalism, class, animality, and forms of violence, and how these mapped to each other, all the while being quite certain of the identities we were discussing, what they were and were not, convinced of their self-integrity as things or structures. And I think this is one form of interdisciplinarity. Then one student said, with hesitation because of her perception of the ill fit of her comment, I'd just like to know what you all believe. because for me, I'm quoting her, so for me, interconnectedness came out first of I think I know what you are all talking about, but for me, interconnectedness came out of my belief, which is Buddhism. It's that interconnectedness, the grain of rice, and then her voice trailed off, and she broke back into the silence to say, look, I've taken up so much space just to talk about that. But another student picked up where she had left off, and in a kind of rhyme told a similar story that had no end, rather an ellipsis, just an experience, one laterally associative, metonymically linked, but linked nevertheless. In this doing, we started to realize a different form of interconnectedness, one lurking beneath. It wasn't all Buddhist, it wasn't all anti-colonial, and it certainly wasn't moving along a single axis of critique. But what it was, perhaps unnameable even in retrospect, and I'm aware we're talking about language here, transformed. The room shifted. Other emotions, laughter, surprise. Words faded, silence came in. We had reimagined and reenacted somehow what interconnectedness could mean. And along the way, we could lose some of the resolute edges of species, of programmed and overdetermined relations of value, that meaty web of determination. We could begin to shed the blanket of capitalism's and colonialism's animal meanings. But I report this humbly, not victoriously, because the surprise was also mine. A reflection, I think, for me, of the depths of secularity, despite a constant wish as professor to foster openings. There are two things I want to note about this story. One is that in the middle of an elite liberal arts school that I was visiting this year, filled with wonderful students, and yet committed, and I think structurally restricted to the point of bodily conduct, civility, proper to education, and made into habitus, to secular theorizing, something that could be called spirit broke through. Why had we all known and practiced together its impermissibility? Two, we didn't end up anywhere. We didn't quite know what we were saying. The takeaway point was to note the nature of the shift, to know that it constituted a reach for a different kind of interconnectedness. At a political moment such as this, I don't know how to describe this moment, but there's a need for many things all at the same time. There's a need for clear, nameable perception of what is happening and what has happened, and meaningful direct means of remedy, clarity with specificity, and without the kind of averaging that leads to the erasure of, maybe we could call them trans-species intersectionalities. So I wish deeply for research and educational institutions to consider this a fundamental goal, and I've seen powerful examples of this work. There's equally, however, a need to recognize what has begun to break or dissolve, what no longer works as diagnostic as we run after desperate conviction. And here I'm thinking about the temporal forms of unscalable multi-species flight that spectacular fires in sight. It's just one of them. But I think this is where system works less well. And this is not metaphysics so much as I think a shifting coagulation. I wish deeply for research and educational institutions to foster and fuel this as well, to be part of a true sense of redeeming, actionally hopeful creativity. And I sense such an impulse in the drive to consider art seriously in the programming for this symposium. So for me, I'm thinking not only about pedagogy, but about academic institutionality as one that in some essential sense forgoes or banishes spirituality as part of a sweeping program that I think had a meaningful history. It's about dealing with the substantial effects of religions, including Christian ontologies, upon intellectual practice and research, infusing colonialities with great chains of being, for instance, and other kinds of legacies that are still being addressed and also unwoven. So yes, but also no. Right? So much has been thrown out, and what I've learned from scholars like Kim Tallbear is that indigenous spirituality has needed to do its resubstantiation of things, species, landscapes, in the face of this secularity and its own demands, right, for a kind of progressivist notion of a building ontology that needs to be proven. Indeed, before I realized better, out of the same secular obligation I claimed my own book, Animacies, was a secular project. How to encounter the dramatic interconnectednesses, foiled and shaken temporalities brought to one, of ash in the aftermath of spectacular fire, as happened in, ironically named perhaps Paradise, California, without complex grief? And are there ways to take that ash as central foci rather than the moment of collapse of a favored species distinction, as is how that has been narrated? Tim Choi has written precisely on the variable substantiation of Hong Kong air, as he puts it, by different parties and communities in that city. Air is not undifferentiated nothingness, but quite lively in its own way and contains substances. Choi writes of a journey of epistemological revision following his and his partner Zamira's illnesses by way of the polluted air during fieldwork. He had to reject his initial attempts to disavow difficulties with the air because, particularly in social theory, air is left to drift, neither theorized nor examined, taken simply as solidity's lack. Air can only be insubstantial. I'm thinking here too of meat as a dead presentism or as an aftermath of industrial killing. Meat and air meet, not only in the, say, conceptual or ontological traffic of co-substantiation, or the place of representative pollution like Hong Kong, but also in the closed spaces of the slaughterhouse. The hacking and grinding of animal killing yields ground meat and airborne particulates, a soup which bears the mark of processing consequence, an abstraction which must be assimilated by the worker. And meat and air meet in all the other ways that animal substances travel into the air, or in the ways that air recirculates into settled substance to be absorbed, managed, and sometimes kept by the human and non-human animal bodies that breathe or otherwise receive, that are porous to the world around them, which is everyone and everything. Choi might refer to these as breathers. As so many here know, these are not fictions, nor are they limited to either science or religion or practical life, for that matter. So there is also ash. In the last few years, California, another non-integrity, has been burning on the regular at the scale of international spectacle. The ash of a fire becomes an inhalant, sometimes marking a trajectory from the same species to the same. There were many human deaths in this town named Paradise, as well as non-human animal deaths and plant deaths. In the last fall semester's teaching at Berkeley, I've bought bulk masks in the midst of thick sunless air for my non-plus students who have been told that school will be canceled only according to federal air quality guidelines, and also only the sensitive should take care when outdoors because they may experience difficulty breathing. What does sensitivity mean? And I say this as a classic asthmatic. If what is burning, what incinerates into the air, is not only some fantasied exterior nature of trees, grasses, dirt, and other distant flora, and their seemingly mundane chemical contents, but also built environments, including houses, cars, barns, garages, and their own contents, such as paints, fuel, solvents, insecticides, as well as living beings, insects, salamanders, bears, deer, frogs, and also people. So that not only are the absorptions by humans and certainly also by others particularly frictive, asthma, but chemical, perhaps intoxication. What kind of ruddy, capacious meat eater is the normate student supposed to be in becoming? Is this the literalization of whiteness's incorporation? Should only the sensitive be kept from eating or becoming differently, even if the advisory might keep them hale for just a little longer? Indeed, it seems at times as if California's air has become something like meat. Scientists have concluded that there will not be a time in California's foreseeable future in which there is no fire happening somewhere in the state. So after years of drought, any generous helpings of rain now only seem to feed the tipped balance in which tender new kindling is grown to feed the next fire as it comes. That is on top of the kindling comprising the housing built into fire zones, pushing back the front of nature in order to be near it. So the painful irony is that this meat, if you call it that, bears the marks of its own history of erasure. The periodic prescribed burns that were the regular practice of Native Americans made such extravagant, let's say, multispecies meatification so much less likely before the settler system of scientific ecological state fire prevention. So far this may feel like a standard cry to the likes of this audience, and I accept that. There's a permanent art installation, a commission at the Magistrates Court in Brisbane, Australia, by the artist Fiona Foley, who is Bachelor, which is a Fraser Island-based Aboriginal people, called Witnessing to Silence. It is the story of a victorious deception, and it came in relation to the Magistrates Court building mandate. So there was a 3-part mandate for the building of this Magistrates Court, which is it's a lower court. 1, to include support for victims of crimes, and I think perhaps this was an architectural instruction. 2, to integrate environmental design, and 3, to include public art. And so I believe that Foley had initially presented the project by way of what reviewers took to mean a natural disaster, what she called Queensland fires and floods. The work that emerged includes a display of ashes in suspension, presumably of bushfires, shards of black inside a vertical glass and metal cabinet that is mounted into the ground. So you see the series of cabinets from a distance here. There are also cast aluminum lilies and granite pavers afoot that I'll mention in a bit. So what did not become evident until later was that these apparent bushfires marked genocidal acts. The ash in these containers marked not of, let's say, the canonical ecological objects of trees and scrub, but of Aboriginal bodies that have been, quote, removed, to use the scientific language of colonial operations, by way of government-instigated massacres all around Queensland. I think there are 69 mentions in this work of 69 massacres, after which the bodies were burned or washed away. So she's referring to fires and floods that were applied directly to the bodies of Aboriginal people. In the ambiguity of bush might be a wry comment on the colonial conflation of Aboriginal people with nature, as if to capitalize on the indigenous relation to land. And this is a close-up of one of the panels of kind of suspended ash. Arrayed on the ground are granite panels, each etched with the name of one site of massacre. So there's so much more to say about this particular work, but the brilliance of it to me is the subterfuge of it. This is not just structural ambivalence, but a before and after pedagogy by which the relative mundanity and sympathy for, say, burnt trees, in a way that fits into a kind of environmental design narrative, gives way necessarily and pointedly to charred human bodies of genocide. And I say subterfuge, but that may not be fair. Foley has represented this under-specification initially of the project as a necessity for her due to the political sensitivity of Queensland's history. Foley's meat then, once bitten, forces digesting, in spite of or because of the contents. And I'll just mention there's another ash, opium ash, to which her work often refers, which I and other students of her work write about elsewhere. There are folded and layered lessons then of the tensions offered by settler forms of scientific ecological management. And for an exposition of this in the context of Hawaii and its relationship to matters of spirit and ancestral relation, I often refer to the article by Jonathan Goldberg and Noinoi Silva. This is a non-neutral mutual enfolding of peoples and things in the environment around them, and the segregated fiction that the lay definition of environment as non-human has come to inhabit. And so I also want to note here that Foley's ash chambers are vertically arrayed as if to reanimate and resuspend that ash, and to provoke a doubt perhaps about both the inevitability of before and after temporalities, as well as the segregatory human-non-human identities that temporality suggests. To substantiate error in ways like this is not to ignore the predictive density of certain relations, of the way blood travels, of the selective porosities of human skin, of the differential scales by which rock becomes air, and by which different kinds of bodies become ash and then become bodies again. But if we remember, say at bottom, rather than exceptionally or provisionally, the non-integrity of things, the work changes quite dramatically. And there are exclusively scientific ways to describe this, right? Porosities, particulates, dust, smoke, wind. But then we can still fall into the conceptual worlds of a kind of scientific ecological management, using them for perhaps compromised ends. In the discussion of genomic models of indigenous identity, Kim Tallbear has written of indigenous notions of peoplehood as emerging in relation with particular lands and waters and their non-human actors, differing from, on the other hand, the concept of a genetic population, which is defined as moving upon or through landscapes. So in the light of such ecological devastation, the meatiness of error, however perverse in this present circumstance, requires so much rethinking, at least for me, and it's worth asking which urgencies will predominate. The complex adoptions and considerations of Aboriginal land management techniques, I think, have developed significantly in both Australia and the US, and in conjunction with important research programs that pitch collaborations between non-Indigenous and Indigenous science and practice. It seems only the beginning of a deeply needed epistemological shift and recognition of the multiple layers of violence, settlement, and resubstantiation beyond these present-day capitalist mappings, the simplest forms of interconnectedness that need first to be accounted for and addressed, even mourned, especially mourned, differentially mourned with all the emotions and ellipses that attain. This incinerator has many bodies. As they burn, they seem to become one, yet they are not the same ash. What to make of this historicity, how to recognize it, record it, face its differences, how to enflesh this air meets non-integrity. Thank you.